It was a quiet Tuesday evening in the suburbs of Seattle. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a burnt-orange glow over the neighborhood, while soft shadows danced across the living room walls of Ethan Carter's modest two-story home. He sat at the dining table, staring blankly at his laptop screen, the cursor blinking as if mocking him. Ethan was in his late 30s, a hard-working software engineer who had spent the better part of the last decade climbing the corporate ladder. His job was demanding, often pulling him into late-night coding sprints and early-morning virtual meetings. But it was all worth it, or so he thought, for the sake of the life he was building with his wife, Claire. Claire was everything Ethan had ever wanted in a partner. Smart, confident, and stunningly beautiful. She had a way of lighting up a room, drawing people to her with her infectious energy and warm smile. They had been married for 7 years, but recently, something felt off. Ethan couldn't put his finger on it at first. Claire had always been outgoing, but in the last few months, her social calendar had become unusually packed. Girls' nights, yoga classes, last-minute errands. Her life seemed to exist increasingly outside the home. At first, Ethan chalked it up to his own paranoia. After all, he had been more absent than usual, drowning in work deadlines. Maybe she was just filling the void his busy schedule had created. But there were small signs he couldn't ignore. The faint whiff of cologne on her scarf, the way her phone was now glued to her hand, the muted notifications she thought he didn't notice. Ethan sighed, closing his laptop. He couldn't shake the growing knot in his stomach, a dull ache of suspicion that had begun to seep into every quiet moment. Tonight, though, was supposed to be different. Claire had promised she'd be home early, and Ethan had taken the rare step of leaving work on time to cook dinner. A gesture of goodwill, a quiet attempt to reconnect. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and garlic as Ethan plated their meal, arranging the roasted chicken and vegetables with careful precision. He glanced at the clock, 7:15 p.m. Claire should have been home 45 minutes ago. His phone buzzed on the counter, and his heart sank as he read the text. Running late. Don't wait up for me. Love you. Smiling face with smiling eye. Ethan stared at the message, his chest tightening. He tried to suppress the nagging voice in his head, the one whispering that something wasn't right. By 9 p.m., Ethan sat alone at the table, the food cold and untouched. The house was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. He decided to distract himself by tidying up, but as he loaded the dishwasher, his eyes landed on Claire's laptop, partially hidden under a stack of magazines on the counter. It was unlike Ethan to invade someone's privacy, especially Claire's. But tonight, desperation overrode his sense of ethics. With trembling hands, he opened the device and was immediately met with a password screen. He hesitated, then typed in Claire's favorite, Sunshine 101. The screen unlocked. What he found next made his blood run cold. Claire's messages and emails were synced to her laptop. Ethan's eyes scanned the text exchanges, his heart pounding as he read through flirtatious messages from an unknown number. There were photos, selfies of Claire in outfits Ethan had never seen before, and plans for secret meetups. One text, in particular, struck him like a dagger to the chest. Can't wait to see you tonight. Same place. Ethan's stomach churned. His breathing became shallow as the realization hit him. Claire wasn't working late. She wasn't with friends. She was with him. Fueled by a mix of heartbreak and anger, Ethan decided he needed answers. He grabbed his jacket and keys, stepping out into the crisp night air. As he backed out of the driveway, he couldn't help but replay the last few months in his mind. The excuses, the distance, the nagging feeling that he was slowly losing her. He followed the address listed in one of the messages, a nearby motel. His heart thudded in his chest as he pulled into the dimly lit parking lot. He spotted Claire's car immediately, parked near the far corner. Ethan's hands trembled as he approached the door to one of the rooms, guided by the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation inside. He didn't knock. Instead, he twisted the doorknob and pushed the door open. What he saw would be etched into his memory forever. Claire was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face flush with surprise as she locked eyes with Ethan. A man, tall, dark-haired, and shirtless, stood nearby, frozen in shock. The room smelled of cheap perfume and betrayal. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Ethan's chest heaved as he struggled to process the scene before him. Claire opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Ethan, I can explain," she finally stammered, her voice trembling. But Ethan didn't want an explanation. He didn't want excuses. He simply turned and walked out, leaving Claire's voice echoing behind him. When Ethan returned home, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. He sat in the dark, staring at the wedding photo that hung above the fireplace. Their smiling faces felt like a cruel reminder of what once was. His phone buzzed with a series of frantic texts from Claire. "Ethan, please. Let me explain. It's not what it looks like. Please come back. I love you." But Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he stared out the window, his jaw tightening as he resolved that he wouldn't let this betrayal define him. He was done being the victim. And that's when the idea for his plan began to take shape. The next morning, Ethan awoke to the faint light of dawn streaming through the blinds. He hadn't slept much. His mind was too busy replaying the events of the previous night. The betrayal, the shock, the anger. It was all still raw, a storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Claire had come home sometime after midnight. He heard her footsteps hesitating outside the bedroom door, but she never came in. Instead, she slept in the guest room. Or at least, he assumed she slept. When Ethan finally got out of bed, the house was quiet. Claire was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she looked like she hadn't slept either. "Morning," she said softly, her voice barely audible. Ethan didn't respond. He walked past her to pour himself a cup of coffee, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. "Ethan, we need to talk," Claire said, her voice trembling. "Do we?" Ethan replied, his tone sharp. "Yes," she said firmly, though her hands were shaking. "I know I messed up. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I need you to understand, it wasn't because of you. This is on me." Ethan laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "That's supposed to make me feel better? That you destroyed our marriage for no reason at all?" Claire flinched at his words, tears pooling in her eyes. "It's not like that. Save it, Claire," Ethan snapped, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't care why you did it. The fact is, you did. And now I have to live with that." For the next few days, Ethan threw himself into work, using it as a distraction from the chaos of his personal life. He and Claire barely spoke, existing like strangers under the same roof. She tried to apologize, tried to explain, but Ethan shut her out completely. It wasn't just anger fueling his cold demeanor. It was pain. Every time he looked at her, he saw her betrayal. Every time she spoke, he heard the lies. One evening, as Ethan sat alone in his car after work, he scrolled through his phone, rereading the messages he had found on Claire's laptop. The pain in his chest was almost unbearable, but amidst the heartbreak, a new emotion began to take hold: determination. Ethan wasn't the type to seek revenge, but this wasn't just about payback. This was about reclaiming his dignity, about making Claire truly understand the depth of the damage she had caused. And so, he began to plan. The first step was gathering evidence. Ethan wanted to ensure that if things escalated, if divorce became inevitable, he would have everything he needed to protect himself. He hired a private investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Lisa Harper who came highly recommended. Lisa didn't sugarcoat things. "If she's still seeing him, we'll find out," she said bluntly as they sat in a quiet cafe discussing the details. "But you need to be prepared for whatever we uncover. This isn't going to be easy." "It hasn't been easy for a while," Ethan replied, his voice heavy. "Just do what you have to do." Over the next week, Ethan watched from the sidelines as Lisa did her work. She followed Claire discreetly, tracking her movements and documenting her interactions. Ethan, meanwhile, focused on his second objective: making Claire feel the weight of her actions. He didn't lash out or confront her outright. Instead, he withdrew emotionally, creating a chasm between them that Claire couldn't ignore. At first, she tried to bridge the gap. She cooked his favorite meals, left handwritten notes apologizing for what she had done, and even suggested couples therapy. But Ethan remained distant, his responses curt and detached. "Ethan, please," Claire begged one night as they sat in the living room, the tension between them palpable. "I know I hurt you, but I can't fix this if you won't let me." Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe some things aren't meant to be fixed," he said simply before walking out of the room. One evening, Lisa called with an update. "I've got what you need," she said. "You were right. She's still seeing him. I've got photos, timestamps, the works. Do you want to see it?" Ethan hesitated. Part of him didn't want to relive the pain, but he knew he needed to face the truth. "Send it to me," he said. When the email came through, Ethan's heart sank as he scrolled through the images. Claire and the man. His name was Ryan, laughing together at a cafe, holding hands as they walked through a park, kissing in the parking lot of the same motel Ethan had visited that fateful night. The betrayal felt like a fresh wound, but instead of breaking him, it steeled his resolve. Ethan began to execute the next phase of his plan. He quietly met with a lawyer to discuss his options, ensuring that he would be protected financially and legally if their marriage ended. But he didn't stop there. Ethan wanted Claire to feel the regret she claimed to have, to understand the full extent of what she had thrown away. He started making subtle changes, updating his wardrobe, hitting the gym, and reconnecting with old friends. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild himself, not for Claire, but for his own sense of self-worth. Claire noticed the changes almost immediately. "You've been going out a lot lately," she remarked one evening, her tone laced with curiosity and jealousy. "Is that a problem?" Ethan asked coolly, not even looking up from his phone. She hesitated, clearly taken aback by his indifference. "No, I miss spending time with you." Ethan finally looked at her, his gaze piercing. "Funny, I missed you for months, but you didn't seem to notice." Claire's face crumpled, and she looked away, unable to meet his eyes. The turning point came when Ethan decided to confront Claire directly, not with anger, but with calculated precision. He printed out the evidence Lisa had gathered and laid it out on the dining table, waiting for Claire to come home. When she walked through the door and saw the photos, her face went pale. "Ethan, don't," he said, his voice cold and steady. "Don't lie to me again." Claire sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she picked up one of the photos. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the undeniable proof of her infidelity. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what else to say. I was selfish and I ruined everything." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You didn't just ruin our marriage, Claire. You ruined the trust, the respect, everything we built together. And for what? Him?" Claire sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said. "You're right," Ethan replied, his tone cutting. "You don't." The air between Ethan and Claire was heavy with tension as she sat at the dining table, surrounded by evidence of her betrayal. Her sobs had subsided into shallow breaths, and she clutched her hands tightly in her lap, as though bracing herself for a storm that had already come and gone. Ethan stood across from her, arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. He'd imagined this moment 100 times in his head, how he'd confront her, the things he'd say, but now that it was here, he felt hollow. The anger, the heartbreak, the humiliation. It had all coalesced into something colder, sharper. "I need to know one thing," Ethan said, his voice low and measured. "Was it worth it?" Claire's eyes snapped up to meet his, wide and glassy. "What? Was he worth it?" Ethan repeated, enunciating each word like a dagger. "Was throwing away our life together worth whatever you had with him?" Claire's lip trembled, but she didn't answer right away. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Wrong answer, Claire. It wasn't about him," she blurted out, tears streaming down her face again. "It wasn't about him. It was about me, Ethan. I felt invisible. You were always working, always busy. I needed to feel like I mattered." Ethan's jaw tightened. "So instead of talking to me, instead of telling me how you felt, you decided to sleep with someone else? That's your justification?" Claire buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I know I messed up. I know I broke us. But please, Ethan. I love you. I still love you. Ethan stared at her, the words ringing hollow in his ears. You don't love me, Claire, he said quietly. If you did, you wouldn't have done this. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Ethan's phone buzzing on the counter. He glanced at the screen and saw a name he hadn't expected, Lisa Harper. Excuse me, he said, stepping into the other room to take the call. Lisa's voice was calm but firm. I thought you'd want to know. Ryan's not just some random guy. He's married, too. Ethan froze, the revelation hitting him like a freight train. What? His wife doesn't know, Lisa continued. But she should. I have her contact information if you want it. Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, disbelief, and a grim sense of clarity. Send it to me, he said, his voice steady. When the call ended, Ethan stood in the quiet of the living room, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Ryan wasn't just a mistake Claire had made. He was someone else's betrayal, someone else's heartbreak. And now, Ethan knew exactly what he needed to do. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in his car, parked outside a cozy suburban home on the other side of town. The house belonged to Ryan's wife, a woman named Melissa. Through the living room window, Ethan could see her sitting on the couch, reading a book, completely unaware of the storm about to upend her life. Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering over the envelope containing the photos and messages Lisa had compiled. Part of him wondered if he was crossing a line, if this was too far. But then he remembered the pain he'd felt when he discovered the truth, the way his world had crumbled in an instant. Melissa deserved to know. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and approached the front door. He rang the bell and waited, his heart pounding in his chest. When Melissa opened the door, she looked at him with polite curiosity. Can I help you? I'm sorry to bother you, Ethan began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. My name is Ethan Carter. I believe you're married to Ryan? Melissa's expression faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. Yes. Why? Ethan held out the envelope. I think you need to see this. Melissa took the envelope hesitantly, her hands trembling as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the contents, her face draining of color with each passing second. No, she whispered, shaking her head. This can't be. I'm sorry, Ethan said softly. I know how much this hurts. I'm living it, too. Melissa's knees buckled, and she sank onto the threshold, clutching the envelope to her chest. How long? She asked, her voice breaking. For months, Ethan replied. I found out a week ago. Tears streamed down Melissa's face as she stared at the man in front of her. Thank you for telling me, she said through her sobs. I don't know what I'm going to do, but thank you. Ethan nodded, his chest heavy with both guilt and relief. You deserve the truth. We both do. When Ethan returned home, the house was dark. Claire was already in bed, her figure barely visible under the covers. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her sleep. He didn't feel pity for her anymore. He didn't feel anger, either. What he felt was something deeper, something harder to define. Closure. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The marriage they once had was gone, shattered beyond repair. But for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Not for their relationship, but for himself. He climbed into bed, keeping his distance from Claire, and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he would start the next chapter of his life. And he wouldn't let this betrayal define him. The following morning, Ethan woke up early. He didn't bother checking if Claire was awake as he quietly dressed and left the house. The weight of the previous night's confrontation still hung over him, but he felt lighter somehow, like he'd taken the first steps toward freeing himself from the suffocating grip of betrayal. As he drove to a nearby park, the sun rising over the horizon, Ethan replayed his conversation with Melissa. He didn't regret telling her the truth. It had been the right thing to do. But her pain mirrored his own, stirring emotions he thought he'd buried. He sat on a bench overlooking a small pond, the still water reflecting the pastel hues of the sky. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, to simply exist in the moment without the crushing weight of anger and heartbreak. Back at home, Claire had woken to find Ethan's side of the bed empty. Panic bubbled in her chest as she called his name, but the house was silent. She wandered through the rooms, her heart sinking with every step. When she found his car missing from the driveway, her mind spiraled with worst-case scenarios. She called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. "Ethan, it's me. Please call me back. I need to know you're okay." Her voice cracked as she ended the call. She was losing him, and she knew it. Ethan returned home around midday. Claire was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice small. "Out," Ethan replied curtly, walking past her to set his keys on the counter. "I was worried," she said, standing up and moving toward him. "I didn't know if—" "I'm fine," Ethan interrupted, his tone cold. "You don't need to worry about me anymore." Claire flinched at his words, her eyes filling with tears. "Ethan, please. I know I've ruined everything, but I don't want to lose you. I'll do anything to fix this." Ethan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Fix this?" he echoed. "Claire, there's nothing left to fix. You didn't just make a mistake, you made a choice. And now, we both have to live with the consequences." Her face crumpled, and she sank into the nearest chair, her sobs echoing through the kitchen. Ethan didn't move to comfort her. He couldn't. Over the next few days, Ethan began making arrangements to move out. He contacted a real estate agent to evaluate their house and started packing his belongings, one box at a time. Claire watched helplessly as he dismantled their life together piece by piece. She tried to talk to him, to convince him to stay, but every attempt was met with the same calm, resolute response. "It's too late, Claire." The more Ethan pulled away, the more desperate Claire became. One evening, she cornered him in the living room as he packed a box of books. "Ethan, I can't do this without you," she said, her voice shaking. "You're my everything." Ethan paused, looking at her with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "If I was your everything, Claire, you wouldn't have done what you did." Her shoulders slumped, and she covered her face with her hands. "I don't know who I am without you," she whispered. Ethan sighed, setting the book in his hand down. "Maybe that's something you need to figure out on your own," he said softly. Meanwhile, Melissa had reached out to Ethan. After their initial meeting, the two had exchanged phone numbers, and she had sent him a text thanking him again for his honesty. "Do you think it ever gets easier?" she had written. Ethan stared at the message for a long time before replying. "I think it has to. Eventually." Their conversations became more frequent over the next few days. They weren't romantic or flirtatious, just two people trying to make sense of the chaos their lives had become. Melissa told him about her 2 children, about how she hadn't yet decided whether to confront Ryan. Ethan shared his own struggles, his fears about starting over. There was a strange comfort in their shared pain, a sense of solidarity that made the weight of their individual burdens a little easier to bear. The day Ethan officially moved out of the house was bittersweet. He had rented a small apartment on the other side of town, a modest but comfortable space where he could begin rebuilding his life. Claire stood in the driveway as he loaded the last of his boxes into his car. She looked fragile, like a gust of wind could knock her over. "Is this really it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan closed the trunk and turned to face her. "I don't know what the future holds, Claire, but I know I can't stay here." Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, her lips trembling as she tried to form words. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Ethan stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said gently, "but I can't be the one to help you anymore." With that, he got into his car and drove away, leaving behind the life they had built together. As Ethan settled into his new apartment, he felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The pain of Claire's betrayal would take time to heal, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was in control of his own life again. He spent his days focusing on work, reconnecting with old friends, and pursuing hobbies he had long since abandoned. Slowly but surely, he began to rediscover himself. The person he had been before his life had revolved around Claire. Melissa became a quiet presence in his life, someone he could talk to without fear of judgment. They didn't see each other often, but their occasional texts and phone calls were a source of comfort for them both. One evening, As Ethan sat on the balcony of his apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it on his own terms. Months passed. The once overwhelming sting of betrayal had dulled for Ethan, replaced by a quiet resilience. His apartment, once sparse and sterile, now felt like a home. The bookshelves were filled, his walls adorned with photographs from his travels, and his kitchen was perpetually stocked with groceries he had started enjoying cooking for himself. He had learned to appreciate the small joys of solitude. The peace of an evening spent reading, the satisfaction of completing a challenging project at work, and the freedom of rediscovering who he was outside of his marriage. Claire had reached out a few times. Her texts were careful, measured. Updates about the house, offers to meet for coffee, and the occasional heartfelt apology. Ethan responded politely but kept his distance. He wasn't angry with her anymore. He simply didn't see a path forward for them. One afternoon, Ethan found himself walking through the park where he had spent so many mornings during the fallout of his marriage. The pond was as still as he remembered, the trees rustling softly in the breeze. As he sat on a bench, he noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Melissa, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. She spotted him and waved, her smile warm and genuine. "Fancy meeting you here," she said, sitting down beside him. Ethan chuckled. "I could say the same to you." They hadn't spoken in weeks, not since Melissa had made the difficult decision to leave Ryan. She had confided in Ethan about the separation, sharing her fears and doubts, and he had encouraged her to put herself first for once. "How are you?" Ethan asked. Melissa shrugged, her smile tinged with bittersweetness. "It's been a roller coaster. The kids are adjusting, but it's not easy. Some days I feel like I'm doing okay, and other days," she trailed off, shaking her head. "You know how it is." "I do," Ethan said softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a pair of ducks glide across the pond. "I've been meaning to thank you," Melissa said finally, "for telling me the truth, for being there when I needed someone. I don't know how I would have gotten through it without you." Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You don't owe me anything, Melissa. We were both just trying to survive." "Maybe," she said with a small smile. "But it helped, knowing I wasn't alone." Ethan nodded, his gaze returning to the water. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "So are you," she replied. That evening, Ethan returned to his apartment feeling lighter. His conversation with Melissa had reminded him how far he had come, not just in healing from Claire's betrayal, but in rediscovering his own strength and self-worth. He poured himself a glass of wine and sat on his balcony, watching the city lights twinkle against the night sky. His thoughts drifted to Claire. He wondered how she was doing, whether she had found peace with herself. Part of him hoped she had. Despite everything, he didn't wish her unhappiness. He thought about Melissa, too. Their connection was unexpected, born out of shared pain, but it had been one of the few bright spots in an otherwise dark chapter of his life. He didn't know if their paths would cross again, but he was grateful for the bond they had formed. And then he thought about himself, the man he had been, the man he was now, and the man he was becoming. Several weeks later, Ethan stood in the doorway of his office, watching his colleagues buzz around the open workspace. He had thrown himself into his career since the separation, and his hard work had paid off. A recent promotion had come with more responsibilities, but also a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. During lunch, one of his coworkers, James, approached him. "Hey, Ethan, a group of us is heading to that new Italian place downtown tonight. You should come." Ethan hesitated. For so long, he had avoided social outings, preferring the solitude of his own company. But something in him had shifted recently, a desire to re-engage with the world, to let people back in. "Yeah," he said finally, smiling. "That sounds great." That evening, as Ethan sat around a table with his coworkers, laughing and sharing stories over plates of pasta, he realized how far he had come. The pain of his past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined him. He had built a new life, piece by piece, and while it wasn't perfect, it was his. As the night wound down, Ethan stepped outside for some air. The cool breeze brushed against his skin, and he looked up at the stars, feeling a profound sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking back. He was looking forward.